Chris went by the office this morning on his way in had to pick up something to bring to church with him. And as he was passing through the office, he heard the first of some phone calls start to come in from this weekend's radio broadcast on the entitled Save Your Children. It was a special program I made a week and a half ago, and we rushed it out to the radio stations. I made the program because I was so stirred by the news event of this young couple who, according to the news media, had given birth to a baby in a hotel room, and it was a perfectly healthy baby boy. And they stuffed it in a trash bag and put it in a dumpster of course, was found dead with a fractured skull, and apparently it died from, according to the medical examiner, from a fractured skull and from shaking, to use his words for it. And I just couldn't get over it. And I felt, I guess, a little bit like Paul after he'd been several weeks in Athens. It says his spirit was stirred within him, and he couldn't be quiet anymore. He had to get out and begin speaking, and so I felt I had to address that. And not only did we start having phone calls on it today, but I got an email on it this morning, so it's out there working. And it's supposed to play, I think, in all of our radio stations this weekend, and if anybody misses it, it'll probably be next weekend. So you'll be able to catch the program on KTVB tomorrow morning at 10:30, or KDFX Dallas at, 9:30 KDFX? Our specialist on this, Chris, back there, doesn't remember that one. He can probably tell you any of the rest of them, but he doesn't remember that one. I think it's 9 or 9:30 on KDFX out of Dallas. I hope you'll try to catch the program. I expect to be doing more and more programs of that nature. I began, just after doing it, I reflected on it quite a bit and thought that really in the world and the way the world is going right now, that type of thing cannot be left unaddressed, especially when you have a forum that's as strong as some 50, I don't know how many, 55 yet, 54 radio stations out there. With that kind of platform, you have to address that. I really think, too, the time is coming, it is now, when more and more of God's people need to be speaking out on the issues around them in society and not just sitting there and letting those things go by without having had something to say about it along the way. Well, being successful in that regard, and I appreciate your prayers on behalf of the program, because at least once a month now I hope to be doing a special program, if not more often than that, and to be able to address some of the problems from a prophetic point of view, which I did in this program, and from other points of view. We are a commandment-keeping people. Now, the next question that follows on the heels of that is, well then, do we believe in salvation by works? Well, now, I already know from your faces you understand, oh no, we don't believe in salvation by works, and that is absolutely true. We do not. I'd like for you, if you turn your passage in your Bible, and if you use a pen to mark your Bible, I want you to be sure you have this particular passage of Scripture marked. I would suggest to you it would be good to memorize it, memorize the reference, so that if you ever need to take someone, turn them to it, and put an end to this question once and for all, here is the answer to that question. Paul, in Ephesians 2, verse 8. Ephesians 2, verse 8. For by grace are ye saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus unto good works, which God has before ordained that we should walk in them. Good works should be a part of the Christian way of life. But you can preface any discussion of the law in relation to a Christian with this statement: we believe that we are saved by grace through faith. We are not saved by law-keeping, commandment-keeping, or anything of the kind. Now, so if we believe that we are saved by grace through faith, why are we a commandment-keeping people? Well, it actually seems almost laughable when you put it that way, but the question is only a little more complicated than that, not a lot. We believe that Jesus did not come to do away with the law because that's what he said. It's a fact. It's in in the core of his teachings in the Sermon on the Mount, and we believe it to be true. Matthew 5 and verse 17. Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. Verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law, till everything has come to pass. Therefore, whoever shall break one of these least commandments, and shall teach men so, shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever shall do and teach them, the same shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Notice, there are great commandments and there are lesser commandments. And the person that does and teaches even the least of these commandments is called great in the kingdom of heaven. And you're in deep trouble, he says, if you teach otherwise. Now, that's not really that hard to follow. The only real reason that there's any difficulty in this at all is because there is a widely held belief that Jesus came to do away with the law, and that Christians are, quote, not under the law, but under grace. Now, with this widespread belief out there, and it permeates most of Protestant Christianity, if you tell someone that you believe the law has not been abolished, what are they going to assume then about your beliefs? They're going to assume from that you believe that you are under the law and not under grace. Now, never mind that doesn't follow. But because of the fact that there is such a strongly held assumption that you're either under the law or under grace, and then if you're under grace, you're not under the law, and if you're under the law, you're not under grace, you tell people that you believe in keeping God's law, you tell them that you don't believe the law is done away with, and just like that, they're going to assume that you are a legalist. And a legalist is a person who believes that it is through the works of the law that you actually accomplish salvation or justification. And having made that assumption about you, everything will go downhill from there in the discussion. And you'll find yourself wandering around in a labyrinth of proof text tossed back and forth about whether you're under the law or under the grace and all sorts of things. They'll take you to Galatians very quickly and Colossians and so forth, and a great discussion will ensue. The possibility there might be an alternative to their assumption doesn't get much time or much thought. Now, there's another angle to this problem, though. And this one is more of an internal problem in understanding the nature of what we're talking about than it is dealing with someone on the outside. It is that there are some Old Testament laws we keep, and there are some Old Testament laws that we don't. A good friend of mine once told me, he said, I don't have any problem with the abolition of law. I have no problem with the idea we're supposed to keep the Ten Commandments. I understand all that. He said, my problem is that I find us playing hopscotch through the Old Testament, keeping this law and not keeping that one. And he said, I do not feel I have a good, clear way of understanding why we keep some and why we don't keep the others. Now, the problem with all this is that the fundamental idea of law is flawed, and it leads us to the wrong conclusions again and again and again and again. And I'm going to give it a try today in your minds to adjust that wrong assumption about the law, the wrong concept of the law. It's not going to be easy to correct it because everybody's gotten in the habit of looking at it one way for so long from both sides of the issues. Either we're not under the law, we're under grace crowd, or the people who believe, no, God's law has not been done away with. We all have looked at things so long the same way, we don't see things clearly anymore. So I'm going to give you today 4 basic ideas for you to think about, study, and pray about. Basic idea number 1. The law is not so much a regulatory device, it is a revelatory device. What's the difference? Well, it's rather large. By this I mean, it is not given to control men's behavior, but to show to man, to reveal to man, revelation, the difference between right and wrong. Now, in fact, the commandment that says you shall remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy really doesn't control you, does it? It has no way of controlling you. You can break it at will. You can go out this afternoon and mow your grass if you want to, or dig a ditch, or work in the garden. There is no controlling factor keeping you from doing that. What the law has done, though, is to reveal to you that that's wrong. That in that great division of the law between the laws that show how to love God and the laws that show how to love your neighbor, This is one of those laws of loving God. And if you do not observe the Sabbath day, you're not learning how to love God as you should. Now, in our society, as an illustration for you, speed limits are controlling devices because they are enforced. They are an effort of the state to control the flow of traffic through towns, down interstates, and wherever else it may be. And they put the black and whites out on those roads and radar traps and what have you to keep us all intimidated, to try to keep us under control. We break them from time to time, but nevertheless, they are there to control. Now, if speed limits are not enforced, they are advisory. And probably one of the examples of that is you've seen these going down the road. There's this diamond-shaped sign that's yellow. It's got an arrow curving off to one side, and down at the bottom of it oftentimes there'll be a little square that says 30 or 40 or 45. Now what this means is that the advisory speed for this turn, be careful, there's a sharp turn ahead, and 30 miles an hour is the recommended speed to go around that corner. In fact, what they're saying is if you take this corner at more than 30 miles an hour, you may end up as roadkill. So we all understand that. However, if you happen to be driving a Jaguar, the chances are you can make that corner handily at 60 miles an hour and not even hear the tire squeak in the process of going around the turn, because of the way the car is built, the suspension. Now, you also at the same time might encounter some fool coming the other way who's cutting the corner a little bit, same speed, also in a Jaguar, and both of you wind up as roadkill, but that's another matter entirely. Now, God's law is more than advisory, but God's law is not generally externally enforced like speed limits. There are no Sabbath cops. Nobody, no policeman around to see to it you keep the Sabbath day. And so consequently, you can break it if you will in the process. Now, what's the difference between the kind of response that I'm talking about, being externally enforced and being, say, naturally enforced? Well, getting a ticket is a penalty. That's external enforcement. Rolling your car in a sharp turn is a consequence. That's a natural consequence of your acts, if you will. A penalty, a natural penalty, not one that's imposed by some external force. Most of the laws of your Bible are enforced naturally. That is, they have consequences. God really only seems to care that much or involve himself in penalties when he has decided it's time to chastise you. Now, the ultimate end of the wages of sin is death, and I suppose you could call that a penalty, but in another sense of the word, no, not really. It's a consequence of breaking the law of God throughout your life. When God penalizes, it is because things have gotten so bad that he has to step in and chastise, or because things have gotten so bad he has to step in and cauterize a wound on the face of the earth, as he did with Sodom and Gomorrah. But most of the time, God does not do that. All that happens are consequences. Now, lest you think I'm a heretic, I'm going to stop at this point and give you a biblical illustration, because I want to be sure we understand this. The illustration is familiar to you, and it's found in Mark, the 2nd chapter, and verse 23. Mark 2, and verse 23. It came to pass that as Jesus went through the cornfields on the Sabbath day, his disciples began as they went to pluck the ears of corn. And the Pharisees said to him, Behold, why do they on the Sabbath day what is not lawful to do? Now, that's a very broad and interesting question here, and a lot of people stumble over this particular point. The fact of the matter is, the 4th commandment says, the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work. The disciples, obviously, and Jesus did not perceive that plucking a handful of grain actually constituted work. I have little doubt that Jesus would have judged that getting out the big cutters and beginning to harvest that grain would be work. Well, where do you draw the line between a handful and a bushel? I don't know. It's a judgment call. Christ's judgment was that his disciples in doing this were doing no wrong. The Pharisees' judgment was that they were. But Jesus said, have you never read what David did when he had need and was hungry, and they who were with him? How he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the showbread, which is not lawful to eat but for the priests, and gave to them that were with him. Now, he didn't argue that it was lawful. He said it wasn't lawful. What David did was not lawful. So apparently, in this particular case, Jesus is indicating that there was an exception that could be made. One would have to say, I would not go so far, by the way, as to call the law of the showbread advisory, but it is very clear from this context that Jesus felt that there was room for an exception to be made in extreme circumstances. He then goes on to say, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath. Now, in this great discussion about under law or under grace, you need to understand, I think, this. The basic principle established here applies to all law, not just the Sabbath day. All of the law was made for man and not man for the law. What's the distinction? Well, that's a part of what we're trying to help you understand. It was given for the good of man. To argue that the law is controlling would be to argue that man is made for the law. In other words, to argue that a man should obey the law for its own sake, as opposed for the good that the law is supposed to provide. Now, if in your judgment an exception to God's law is called for in some unusual circumstance, you need to remember that you will answer for that exception that you make. Who will you answer to? To me? No. Nor to one another. The only one you will have to answer to for it is God, and perhaps in a way to yourself. In this particular case, Jesus did not disapprove the exception that David made. The one thing I would be careful about is not to play games with God's law, and to remember that the exception does not do away with the rule. As the old saying goes, the exception proves the rule. The fact that there is an exception to it establishes the rule. And the fact that on some rare occasion there's an ox in the ditch and you have to work on the Sabbath day has not suddenly opened the doors for you to work on the Sabbath day anytime, any place. How hard is this to understand? Now God, this is another thing you need to understand when you make an exception because of an ox in the ditch or because you're hungry and the showbread is there to be eaten. God may not punish you for making the exception, but you may still be subject to the consequences of what you did. Just like when you are on the way to the hospital and you're driving too fast, they may not give you a ticket for it. But at the same time, you are driving dangerously, and if you get hurt, you will get hurt. There's nothing the police can do to keep it from happening to you along the way. If you drive fast and you feel it's an exception, you have to bear the consequences even though they may not impose a penalty. The same thing in a way is true of many of God's laws. You may not have a penalty imposed by God because He is taking mercy upon you in your circumstance, but that does not mean that you will escape the consequences. Just like if you were able to make this corner at 60 miles an hour in your Porsche, that does not mean you can do it tomorrow in your dad's Roadmaster, which has a whole different set of dynamics. You may be upside down in the field. Obedience to God's law requires judgment, is what this principle is about. Basic idea number 2. The law has existed outside of any administration and has at times been included in an administration. Now, why is that important, and what do I mean by that? Okay, from the very beginning, there was a law in existence that man knew about. There are some classic inferences to be drawn from the book of Genesis as you make your way forward from Adam really all the way through the book of Genesis to Moses in the book of Exodus. In fact, you can study it carefully and you can find that it was considered a sin to violate every single one of the 10 Commandments prior to Moses. I mean, the commandments are laid out for you in there, either in stated form or else as showing consequences or what have you from the disobedience of the 10 Commandments. More than that, there are other laws as well. For example, there must have been some standard of offerings, because when Cain and Abel brought their offerings to God, one of them was accepted and the other one was not. The only possible reason that Cain's offering could not have been accepted was because there was something wrong somewhere that he had reason to know better than and be that way. So there were standards of behavior, law, worship, or what have you, right from the very beginning. The mere fact that we don't have them codified for us doesn't mean a thing. We can tell from the historical record that they were in effect. So the law existed apart from any administration of that law, certainly any human administration, long before Moses. We've addressed that particular question. In fact, I think there's a tape about the Ten Commandments before Moses, if any of you would like to study it in more detail. However, you can probably do just about as well by reading the book of Genesis carefully, looking for them as you would any other way. Then there is this particular passage which I like. Genesis 26 and verse 1. There was a famine in the land besides the first famine that was in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went up to Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, to Gerar. And the Lord said to him, don't go down into Egypt. You go where I'm telling you to go. Sojourn in this land. I will be with you. I will bless you. For I'm going to give to you and to your seed all these countries, and I will perform the oath that I swore unto Abraham your father. I will make your seed to multiply like the stars of the heaven, and will give your seed to all these countries, and in your seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. Why? Because Abraham obeyed my voice, kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. You realize what you're reading here suggests that there was not merely a set of commandments. There was a whole structure of law that Abraham was informed of. Why don't we have a record of them? Probably because the person who was writing all this down was also writing down all the law in another place. Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. So the law was all being written down, and never occurred to that author to say, well, when did God reveal his law, his statutes, and his judgments to Abraham? I don't know. All I know is he did, because if he hadn't, there could be no credit coming to Abraham, because he kept God's commandments, his statutes, and his laws. There was, however, during all these early years, no administration beyond family. Abraham was the head of his family, of course, but there was no particular administrative structure of judges and priests and all this thing to observe these laws. There was no intermediary. If you had an animal sacrifice to offer, there was a right way to offer it and a wrong way to offer it. Do you remember, for example, that when Noah took all the animals into the ark, that he took in so many of each unclean animal and each clean animal? That distinction was made. And everybody knew you didn't offer an unclean animal to God. And if you wanted to offer an animal, you had to go build an altar, and you had to kill the animal, and you had to offer the offering to God according to what you knew was right. But when it came to Moses, a priesthood was established as intermediaries, and they came to offer all those offerings for the people in order, to some extent, apparently, to prevent idolatry and offering them under every green tree wherever they might happen to go. So once an administration came along, things changed. Prior to Moses' administration, a man had to do it himself. The father was the head of his family. He was the priest for his own family. And so on it would go. So there was no administration beyond the family, and at times there was not even that. A man was on his own, by himself, and had to be his own servant of God. But when Israel came out of Egypt as a nation, God then framed the law with a covenant and created the Mosaic administration to administer that law for the community. Now, not a very good analogy, but it'll have to do for the moment. If you've ever bought paintings, sometimes you can pick them up if you're overseas or something like that and you don't want to lug a frame or something back. You buy the painting that's on canvas, they roll it up in a little cylinder, shove it into a tube, put a cap on the end, seal it up, and you carry it home in a good hard tube. Then you get home, you pull it out, take it down to a framer, they put it in a frame for you when you get there. That in a sense the law is like the painting, and it is placed in a frame. And I've had occasion once or twice in my lifetime to reframe paintings that I've owned, because the house is different, the place is different, this doesn't look right, let's put a new frame on that painting, it'll look better in this location. And so we do. So you have a situation of a law that existed, and then it is placed inside a framework, or perhaps better understood as an administration. Laws that existed in the background are now made explicit. Laws that only had consequences before now have penalties. Why? Well, because the actions that you now begin to undertake living in a community of believers affect the other members of the community. And so certain levels of discipline were required. There were health laws, for example, that if you had leprosy, you were not you had certain restrictions placed upon you. If you had certain kind of infections, you had restrictions placed upon you. If you touched a dead animal, you might have a bacterial infection from it, and you were to stay away from people and wash yourself. All these things were required, and all of them were carried out with a certain amount of discipline. And of course, people were prohibited specifically on pain of death on one occasion from going out and gathering their firewood on the Sabbath day. They wanted peace in the community on the Sabbath day. And you couldn't have people out here, every man doing as he pleased, gathering wood, hammering nails, driving stakes in the ground, or whatever they wanted to do on the Sabbath day. So community required some level of enforcement. So the Mosaic Law created an administration around the existing law of God. Laws that existed in the background are made explicit. Penalties are prescribed as the covenant enters into the necessity of controlling people whose actions might be a threat to the community. But even the explicit laws for the community at that time are important for us today in the 20th century because they reveal the judgment of God as it applied in that circumstance and in that time. We have no use exactly for the law regarding slaves in the Old Testament. But to say that those laws are abolished would be to say that if at some time in the future we were living in a circumstance that did allow slavery, that those laws would not be in effect. Whereas in truth, the laws that protected the life of a slave would be in effect if we had slaves today. And something I don't think very many people have considered. Jesus reveals a different administration of that law, and he modifies some of the judgments because they will now apply to a spirit-led community, and it will also apply to individuals apart from the community. Jesus comes along and it starts it right away in the Sermon on the Mount. I won't go to that today. I'll leave it for you to study it. He starts right off in the Sermon on the Mount reframing the law. And the reason why he makes the statement in the Sermon on the Mount, don't think I've come to destroy the law. I have not come to destroy it. I've come to fulfill it. The reason he makes that statement is because he is going to reframe the law. And there are going to be some fools that are going to think that he's doing away with it because he changes some of the Pharisees' regulations, judgments, and what have you, as to how the law would be kept in that time. So Jesus reframes the law. Now, Paul makes an interesting hint at this, and it's a scripture I think that's not well understood, and it's a good opportunity for me to go through it with you so you will understand exactly what Paul is saying. It's in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, and I'm going to begin reading for you in verse 4. Such trust have we through Christ toward God, not that we are sufficient of ourselves to think anything of ourselves. Our sufficiency is of God, who has made us able ministers of the New Testament, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. For if the ministration of death, written and engraven in stones, was glorious, so that the children of Israel could not steadfastly behold the face of Moses for the glory of his countenance, which glory was to be done away. By the way, it's the glory of Moses' countenance that was to be done away and would fade away, not the law in this verse. I mean, even if you believe the law is gone, you cannot use this verse to say that. But notice what he's talking about. He is talking about an administration. Moses' law was an administration, or his administration was an administration of death. They had the power of life and death over people regarding the violation of God's law. Here they are encamped. Now, you should bear in mind that the law that I'm going to be talking about here is a judgment that was rendered in a specific circumstance. And it is recorded, the historical event is recorded in a set of judgments, not as history. But there came a day when first of all, the law said that you are not to sin presumptuously. It had many specific things about if you sin carelessly or accidentally, or I presume under pressure, under duress. But it also was very stern about presumptuous sin. And then it tells you about a young man who went straight out on the Sabbath day, and I have to presume presumptuously with a high hand, began to gather sticks on the Sabbath day. Bang! The law is broken right off the bat. They arrest him. They bring him in. They don't know what to do. So Moses goes to God and says, we have this fellow. He was out gathering sticks on the Sabbath day. What do we do? God said, put him to death. So Moses' administration was an administration of death. It included penalties because we are in a covenant, in a community with an administration, and the law applies in a community with an administration in different ways from what it will apply to a person who's out on his own. Can you ever gather sticks on the Sabbath day? If you're camped out somewhere and there's wood over here somewhere to be had, you're running low at the fire, and you go up over there and pick up some sticks and carry them and put them on the fire, have you committed a sin? Oh, I think probably not. It is an exception which you can make for yourself, realizing that the consequences are there for God to apply, or for any penalty He should wish to do so. That's between you and God. But this was in a community where there was a necessity of beginning to bring some discipline to the community. And where the discipline of the community was important, different things had to be done. A lot of people assume that the example in Nehemiah of Sabbath keeping, where he was going to had the gates locked and closed and ran people away from the gates of the city, that means that you could never ever hand money from one person's hand to another on the Sabbath day. That's not the law, folks. That is a judgment of a civil official who's trying to keep his town under control and to keep the den down around the town. He had the authority to make that judgment and to administer the law in that way. That was in the Old Covenant administration, but it was beyond that. We're down to a civil administration in Israel, which is hardly has any relationship in a way to what Moses was doing when Israel came out of Egypt. So here are these administrations that come along. Now he then says, if this is true, if that glory was to be done away, shall not the administration of the Spirit be rather glorious? For if the ministry of condemnation, the ministration of condemnation be glorious, how much more does the ministration of righteousness exceed in glory? For even that which was made glorious, that is the old, the glory of Moses' countenance, had no glory in this respect. It pales by comparison to the glory of the New Testament Spirit-filled administration of the law. This is where that old distinction comes from, about people talking about the spirit of the law, the letter of the law. And that under Moses' administration, all they could administer was the letter of the law. You remember this, the statue of Justice, who's carrying the scales in her hands? What kind of eyes does she got? You don't know, because she's blindfolded. The whole idea behind justice is that it takes no respect of persons. I mean, you break the law breaks you, that's it. And as it said, they who sinned under Moses' law died without mercy at the hand of 2 or 3 witnesses. No mercy. That law was pretty tough. The administration of the Spirit does not do that. It introduces compassion and mercy. Now, Paul says in verse 12, seeing then that we have such hope, we use great plainness of speech, not like Moses, who put a veil on his face, that the children of Israel could not steadfastly look to the end of that which is abolished. What's abolished here? The law? Hold it. Why did Moses have to put a veil on his face to keep people from seeing the law? No. He put the veil on his face to keep them from seeing his face, which was shining because he had been in the presence of God and received the law. They could not watch the fading glory in Moses' face. But their minds were blinded, for until this day remains the same veil in metaphor, untaken away in the reading of the Old Testament, which veil is done away in Christ. Even unto this day, when Moses is read, the veil is upon their heart. And they don't really understand what they're reading. All they can do is apply the law in the letter. All they can do is try to stone people. They do not understand the concept of mercy. Nevertheless, when he shall turn to the Lord, the veil shall be taken away. Now the Lord is that Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's liberty. So the Old Testament, that is the Old Covenant, involved an administrative framing of the law to apply it to a community. The New Covenant does not abolish that law. Rather, it reframes the law with a new administration. So, when you ask which of the Old Covenant laws we observe today, the answer is we observe all of them in the Spirit. in the intent of the law. For example, there are laws in the Old Testament that allow a man to sell his daughter to a landlord or neighbor of his who's fairly well off to be the wife of his son. Do we observe that law? Well, no, of course not. Not in our society. But when you read the law and you understand what's happening here and you look at the society in which the law was delivered, it slowly becomes apparent to you that the purpose of that law was to protect the rights of that young girl so she couldn't just be sold off willy-nilly and people do anything they wanted to with her. It actually, in its day and in its time, was a protection of the rights of women. So I observe that law today in the Spirit. I feel I have an obligation to respect the rights of women and to protect the rights of women in a society that still hasn't got that straight. So that law hasn't been abolished. It sits there right on the books to tell us what God's mind was in that circumstance at that time, and it gives us a glimpse into the mind of God, which we otherwise might not have. We observe all of them. We observe the Sabbath, we observe the holy days, we observe tithing, we observe the dietary laws, and we accept Christ's judgments of how the law should be kept. The law is not our ruler. Christ is our ruler. The law is not our judge. Christ is our judge. And there's an enormous distinction between those things. The law is merely the teaching of Christ about our conduct, about our lives, and about the way that we are going to live them. Matthew 23, verse 2, begins to draw a really interesting contrast. Jesus said in Matthew 23 and verse 2, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Now he's talking about Moses' administration, which administration has passed for any Christian. The scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. All, therefore, they bid you observe, you do it, because after all, they're within their authority. But I will say this, you'd better not do after their works, because they say, and they don't do. They bind heavy burdens, grievous to be borne, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their little fingers. That was the administration of the Pharisees. Now notice the contrast in the administration of Jesus. Matthew 11 and verse 28. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and you shall find rest unto your souls, for my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. Jesus' administration is very different. It's an administration of mercy and of compassion. It's not an administration that ignores law. It's not an administration that does away with or abolishes law, but it is an administration that forgives our transgressions of the law and extends mercy toward us. Now, Matthew will illustrate this difference with two very interesting contrasting administrations. Now, we've already read Mark's version of this, but I want to come to Matthew's because he includes a bit more that Mark does not mention. This is Matthew, the 12th chapter. Once again, it's the illustration of the men walking through the field of corn on the Sabbath day. So they're wandering through the corn. They were hungry and began to pluck the ears of the corn and to eat. When the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, Behold, your disciples do that which is not lawful on the Sabbath day. That's not to be done. Then Jesus said to them, Haven't you read what David did when he was hungry and they who were with him? Now, the Pharisees' interpretation of the law regarding what you do about passing through a field on the Sabbath day, Jesus saw as an unnecessary stricture, an unnecessary burden, as a heavy yoke. And he said, I don't see this way. He said, haven't you read? And then he gave them this classic example of a law to which David made an exception, which Jesus himself now, a little bit later, approves and says, this is a correct way to look at the law. It wasn't lawful, but they did it anyway. He says, haven't you read in the law how that on the Sabbath days The priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? Now, Mark didn't mention that. What's he talking about? Well, the Sabbath day says you shall not do any work. Don't you realize? And then along comes the ceremonial law and says the priests have got to offer all these offerings on the Sabbath day. Now, you do realize, don't you, that the priests were engaged in considerably more work on the Sabbath day, killing those animals and offering them on the altar, than these men were grabbing a handful of grain walking through a field? And Jesus said, they do that and they are blameless. Why? Well, because here we have a classic illustration of two laws. One that says you will do no work on the Sabbath day, and the other one that says you have to offer these animals on the Sabbath day, coming into conflict with one another. Now, wouldn't you assume that when there is a conflict between two of God's laws, when you can't keep them both and you're going to break one if you keep the other one, that the greater law should be the law that prevails? Sure. At the same time, wouldn't you assume that the Ten Commandments are the greater law than the ceremonial, the sacrificial law? Yeah. But what happens? The ceremonial law takes precedence. Why would that be? Well, I don't think that's that difficult. Because the ceremonial law, the sacrificial law, is actually a playing out on the stage of the temple of the plan of God for the rescue of man. It is the gospel, in fact, Old Testament style, played out with animal sacrifices, where we actually see the shedding of blood, the forgiveness of sin, and that actual sacrifices in the temple, in one way, were precursors of the sacrifice of Jesus Christ and of his administration that would come later. He said to them, but I say unto you, that in this place is one greater than the temple. And if you had known what this means, if you could just have understood this one short passage, I will have mercy and not sacrifice. If you just have understood that, you would not have condemned the guiltless. He said his disciples were guiltless in doing what they did. And you wouldn't have condemned them for that if you had just understood the difference between mercy and sacrifice. My administration, says Jesus, is an administration of mercy. Yours is one of requiring the last ounce of whatever has to be done because of what someone has done. For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath day. So Jesus Christ's administration of the law is a merciful administration. Now, this will cause some grinding of the teeth among some people who are of a very strict mind relative to the law of God. And you will recall that I said earlier in this that the exception only proves the rule. And that in no way do I minimize the law of God. I believe in the law of God. I practice the law of God. I try to live the law of God in my life. But I realize that the law was made for me. I was not made for the law. I realize that Jesus Christ is my ruler, not the law. I realize that it is his administration of that same law, not a new law, not a different one, but the same law, his administration of that law that I must follow and I must live by his example and by his teaching. Basic idea number 3, and this one is very important to understand. The law grows out of the nature of God and the nature of man. It is not arbitrary. And by that I mean the commandment could not just as easily have read, thou shalt commit adultery. We do understand that, don't we? Now, you would be surprised how many people operate on the assumption that the law of God is arbitrary. That is to say, it could just as easily have been written otherwise. I would say that probably far more people who believe in God at all believe that the law of God as given to Moses was arbitrary than don't. Now, the law is arbitrary is a tacit assumption underlying the idea that the law has been abolished. For any law that can be abolished could just as easily have never been administered in the first place. And if it didn't have to be administered in the first place, it was arbitrary. So my contention is that the law was not arbitrary. It grows out of the nature of God and the nature of man. And that brings us to the two great divisions in God's law. In Matthew 22, in verse 37, they asked Jesus about the law. What is the great commandment in the law? What is the really important thing out of the law? And Jesus said to him in verse 37, Matthew 22:37, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like unto it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." Now that's important. Every law in the Old Testament, I don't care which one it is subsumed under these two principles. Love of God, love of neighbor. All of them. Now perhaps it's my own weakness, but I am often unsure about how to love my neighbor and how to love God on occasion because of questions or challenges or conflicts or things that arise. I mean, are there any of us that really have just a clear vision all the time, any day of the hour, morning or night, we know exactly how to love God and how to love our neighbor? Well, if you do, it's probably because you have been a very, very careful student of God's law. Because in that law you find example after example after example after example of how to love your neighbor. And you find very specific instructions on how to go about loving God. Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy, is one place where you go. You shall have no other gods before me. That's another one. You shall not take my name in vain. That's another one. These are all simple principles. The Old Testament is a treasure of specific instances on how to love your neighbor and how to love God. And like I said, the frame has been changed around all of this, and a new administration is here. But the nature of God hasn't changed, and the nature of man hasn't changed. And therefore, those laws that tell us how those things work haven't changed either. It's just that now we have a merciful administration. We do not have to worry so much about a community or civil government involved in it. Therefore, some aspects of the old law we don't apply, like stoning and so forth anymore, because we don't have that authority to do it. But nevertheless, the law of God has not changed. Only the judgments are different. Basic idea number 4. This was the shortest of them all. The law defines sin. The wages of sin is death. All have sinned. That's a pretty tough consequence, isn't it? Then all are going to die. The law cannot save. It just can't do it. All the law can do is identify us as sinners worthy of death. Can't save us. All the law can do is point a finger. Say, he did it. She's guilty. That's all the law can do. So, that being the case, how can we be saved? Well, it's so simple. Ephesians 2:8. By grace are ye saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. And so you see, in the end of all this, and when you take a look at the whole thing, we are not legalists. We are law-abiding Christians who are under grace.